Okay, the next piece is a piece that I did a couple years ago. And this was using film for its physicality. I mentioned before about how film is a physical thing. It can get damaged, it can get scratched and messed up, and then when you print from that, those things stay in the final print. This one, I set it on fire, I cracked it, scratched it, sewed it back together, and covered it in tape before printing it. You're laughing at me. So I had seen photographs before where this had happened by accident. I'm not very good at taking care of my negatives, so there were some that I needed to print, and they were messed up. Like, okay, well, I really want this thing, but it's scratched here, but I'm going to print it anyway. So I did, and I liked what I saw, so I did it on purpose. And then later, like after doing this, it brought me to another project of mine. This was taken at the Sedlik ossuary in the Czech Republic on a piece of stitched film. This is strips of 35mm film sewn together with a needle and thread in complete darkness into a sheet that was about this big and shot in a large format camera. I just really liked the damage that happens to film, the very physical nature of it. And I also really liked the fine-grain, high-quality effect of shooting large format, so I just kind of mashed the two together, see what would happen. And I showed you multiple exposures before. That's another technique that I really liked, and I was curious to see kind of how far I could go with it. This is one of my early attempts with it. 6 ships. It was taken here in Berlin last year at the Technical Museum where they have all of those model ships. I picked 6 of them that I liked and shot all of them on one piece of film, all overlapping. I really like the concept of layering moments of time. And the way that film works, it's only the light hitting the film that affects it. The darkness doesn't do anything to it. So you can just keep layering exposure on there, and only the light parts will overlap. So that's why in the middle there it gets really bright, because there was a bunch of bright stuff that piled up. And I found that this worked really well for performances. This is Unwoman, a musician in San Francisco. She's a cellist. And this was another one where I did 6 exposures of her while she was playing. And I got the movement of her face and the movement of her arm playing the cello. I started using this technique a lot as an adaptation of really only having very slow film and shooting where there wasn't much light. So slow film, if you're not familiar with it, it means that it takes a lot more light to change the film than if it was a fast film. It also means that it has very fine grain, which I really like. So they recommend that you only shoot this in bright daylight. But I don't tend to shoot in bright daylight a lot, so something needed to happen. So I'm like, all right, I need more light to hit this, and the ways of controlling this on the camera, you either open the shutter, or you open the aperture a lot and make a much larger hole for the light to come in, or you leave the shutter open for a longer period of time. The aperture was already open all of the way, so I couldn't control that anymore. And leaving the shutter open for 4 seconds or so was not really what I wanted to do. This was handheld. And I was quite familiar with what kind of failure that would produce. I was kind of sick of just having very blurry images of like motion blur of an arm moving like that. So I wanted something different. And it doesn't really matter what moments of time you decide to put on the piece of film. It does, like that, the time that it's being exposed doesn't need to be continuous. So I just did multiple exposures to get the very crisp edges of having a fast exposure, but layering it to get enough to have an actual image. And just to compare, the next one is a digital photograph that I took at the same concert with a much higher ISO. So this one, there's a little bit of motion blur in her hand, but it's this is like a relatively normal photograph. The color is strange because of stage lighting, but there's nothing really remarkable about this photograph. So I've come to carry two cameras most of the time, like a digital camera and a film camera. Because the film camera can do stuff that the digital camera can't. And then the digital camera can do things like this, getting the more like standard documentary style photograph that the slow film just won't do. And here's an example by somebody else doing a similar technique. This is Elliot I'm killing the name here. Elisiphone, and this is Duchamp descending a staircase, inspired by his famous painting from the early 20th century, Nude Descending a Staircase. And this looks like it was done as a long exposure, but used in a completely darkened room using a flash, just triggered multiple times. And it has a similar effect to the multiple exposure effect, just like layering little fragments of light on top of the film. And this is another one of mine using that technique in another concert and portraiture. And now I'm going to go into digital photography. And this one by Farrell Eves, he dropped his digital camera into a pond when he was at a photography workshop. And he pulled it out and like took all the pieces apart and like let them dry. And after letting that happen for a little while, put it all back together and tried to use it again. And this is what it was doing. But instead of just seeing this as a broken camera and that he was done with it, he decided to continue doing this. He has a whole gallery up online of photos that he's taken with this camera. He calls it his magic camera. Okay, and the next one is kind of similar. This is by Xiaoleko Xing, a photographer from San Francisco. And he posted these on Flickr a little while ago from a corrupted CF card. So I saw these and immediately I'm like, these are awesome. And people were commenting on them, saying that he should print these really big. This is something that he didn't intend this to happen. The card broke. But instead of seeing it as a flaw, instead of seeing it as something that had just entirely gone wrong, he embraced it and used it on purpose. Though he didn't do this exact one on purpose, he put it online, and the act of choosing that as a photograph was definitely on purpose. And the next one I have is by Ruben Abdi. He might be here. And he's doing something really interesting here, where he's combining the strange artifacts of film and also of the HDR process. Some of you might be familiar with this. It's usually just done with digital photography, because what you're doing is you're taking a whole bunch of different